I want to talk about the thing that we have in common, which is the erosion of the Constitution. And I gave a speech in Berlin, I think last August, at the beginning of the pandemic, where I talked about Hermann Goering's observation at Nuremberg, where he was on trial and he was eventually executed. He said at that time, he didn't say it in the Nuremberg transcripts, he said it in a private conversation with a psychologist called Gustavo Gilbert, who was given access to the prisoners in Nuremberg. And that discrepancy, by the way, has been exploited by the modern propaganda juggernaut, these fact-checking organizations, which of course are funded by Bill Gates, by Facebook, by the medical cartel, by the State Department, saying that he never said these words at Nuremberg. And it's true, he didn't say them in the transcript of Nuremberg, but they were recorded by Gustavo Gilbert. And what he said is, Gilbert said to him, how did you do this to the German people? And he started explaining all their propaganda techniques. And Gilbert interrupted him and said, but that couldn't happen in a democracy because there's free choice, there's critical thinking. And he said, you can do this. Goering said, you can do this in any system. It doesn't matter whether it's a democracy or a monarchy or a communist system or a fascist system. All you need to do is invoke fear. You tell the people they're under attack, that you're the only one who can save them, and that anybody who disagrees with you is a threat to the Commonwealth. And they will do anything that you tell them to do. And today, Hitler was democratically elected by the most well-educated people on the planet, the highest level of education, and some of the most tolerant people in Europe at that time. The reason there were so many Jews in Germany is because they fled. Germany was very bad at the Jews long before Hitler, and much less bad than the Eastern European countries or Spain or the other countries from which they fled to come to Germany. And so you had a people that historically were tolerant, open-minded, questioning, and critical. And probably the Weimar Republic was the strongest democracy in Europe. And Hitler was elected. He did not take over. He was elected by people who he had 3% of the vote in the previous election. And then he won with the majority because he was able to manipulate the use of fear. And we've seen one of the alarming parts of this pandemic for those of us who are a little conversant with the kind of medical paradigms that are being invoked right now, to understand with such clarity the manipulations that are taking place, the chicanery, the hiding of real data, the obscuring of all of these, of true facts and figures that we could use to make rational policy decisions. How do case fatality rates relate to the seasonal flu for each age group? Who is dying at what age? Who is not? Who is, what are the real death counts from COVID? CDC has admitted that 96% of the people, only 4% of the people who are characterized, who it classifies as having died from COVID, died from only COVID. At the average number of potentially fatal comorbidities in the remaining 96% is 3.8. The people who died, 96% of them had almost 4 other reasons that might have killed them. And the manipulation of the death certificates, the manipulation of the PCR tests, all of these manipulations that are all designed, the Gates-funded projection that from the London and from IMHE in Washington, which they used to manipulate the lockdowns, which we now see were 40 times the death rate that actually was imposed by COVID. So all of these mechanisms appear to have been deliberately manipulated to put our population in a state of fear. And what happens when you have a population in fear? You have the complete obliteration of critical thinking. And people stop asking questions, and it is a biological impulse. We retreat to the hardwired impulses that were hardwired into us during the 20,000 generations that the human race was wandering the African savanna in small tribal groups, at war, embattled, besieged all the time. And the only way to survival was to follow a strong male leader, to embrace a common orthodoxy that would provide unit cohesion, and then to practice blind obedience to the leader. And that's where we all go in times of fear, unless we have something else that says to us, I'm going to question this. I'm going to start questioning these things. And when you start doing that with the orthodoxies, now the official orthodoxies, the whole thing falls apart. But we've all seen this kind of bewildering imposition of totalitarian controls in our society, which we've never, and attacks on the United States Constitution that are unprecedented in American history. Remember, during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln tried to abandon habeas corpus, just one provision of the United States Constitution. The court said, you can't do that. There is no emergency exemption in the United States Constitution. And there's certainly no pandemic exemption. And it's not that our framers did not know about pandemics. There was a pandemic during the Revolutionary War that brought the army of smallpox, brought the armies of New England to a standstill for 3 months. And they all knew about it. And there was another pandemic during the American Revolution of malaria. And Washington, ironically, used the bark of the chinchoa tree, which is the modern analog of hydroxychloroquine, to end that pandemic. And so they knew about what pandemics were, but they didn't put in the United States Constitution that all of these rights will be suspended as soon as we have a pandemic. And here, James Madison said, the reason we put the First Amendment, the right to free speech in the First Amendment, is because all of the other civil rights and human rights and constitutional rights are based upon it. If a government can hide what it's doing by censoring its opponents and silencing dissidents, it has license to do anything that it wants. So they got rid, they conspired with the social media and the media. We now have the emails that show Fauci corresponding with Zuckerberg, telling him what to shut down and what not to shut down. And they shut down the critics, and once they did that, once they imposed censorship, and they closed debate off on the public square, they were able to go after all the other amendments. So they went after religious freedoms. They closed the churches in this country, every church in this country, for a year. And they kept the liquor stores open as essential businesses. There's no protection of liquor stores in the United States Constitution. There is protection of churches. They abolished religious exemptions. They got rid of jury trials. One of the first things that they did, the Seventh Amendment right to jury trials, Seventh Amendment says, under no conditions will Americans be denied their right to a trial by their peers in matters exceeding $25 in value. And yet they gave anybody who claims, any corporation that claims to be implementing a countermeasure is now immune from lawsuits. Oh, no matter if it's a vaccine maker, remdesivir maker, no matter how negligent that company is, no matter how reckless their conduct, no matter how grievous your injury or death, you cannot sue them. They got rid of the rights of association, rights of assembly, by telling us we had to social distance from each other, we can't gather in crowds. Imagine this. They got rid of property rights. They closed every business, 1 million businesses in this country, without due process and without just compensation, in direct violation of the Constitution. They got rid of due process, notice and comment rulemaking. We know how you pass rules in this country in a democracy. Congress can pass rules. They can vote, they can deliberate as they see fit. A regulatory agency cannot do that. And an executive cannot do that. Because the courts, and we all were frightened to death, were creating these unelected officials. We have to have some democratic control. So, and I've been suing people for 40 years, governments, the EPA, the Interior Department, all the state EPAs, for doing kind of regulatory favors for industry without going through the regulated process. Here's what you have to do when you pass a regulation. You have to propose a rule. You have to publish a proposed rule. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to get everybody to put on masks. You have to publish an environmental impact statement, a regulatory impact statement, an economic impact statement saying, here's the science that we use to support that rule. Here's the justification for it. Here's the people who will be hurt and the financial cost of those people and other costs. Here are the advantages and the benefits of that rule. They all have to be quantified. And then they have to give the public a chance to comment, notice and comment. The public then writes in and says, wait a minute, I run a wilderness kayaking group that you're going to put out of business and destroy, and there's no reason there's no science that says that masks will, on these outside settings, are going to help. Why don't you exempt my business? Every business has a right to write in and say, or we can do this, we can do that, we can mitigate the risk. So let's change the rule to accommodate that so it's as narrowly tailored as possible as the law requires. None of that happened. And then we get to cross-examine them, and then they cross-examine ours, and then the administrative law judge rewrites the rules according to, so that they aren't arbitrary and capricious, and then recommends them. And if they don't reflect the evidence, we can sue the agency. So there's all these democratic protections. All of that was waived. All of these things were imposed upon us by fiat, with no discussion, no science cited. And also all this track and trace surveillance is violating our right to not have warrantless searches and seizures. You go through the entire Bill of Rights, and with one exception, the Second Amendment, they have all been obliterated. And the weird thing to me is I grew up in a liberal milieu where everybody I knew was saying the one thing we got to do is protect the Constitution. And to have my side, either ones who are advocating censorship and these kind of controls and the erosion and subversion of our traditional Bill of Rights is really, it is surreal. People were talking about the Nazis and how the German people, this could have happened to them. And my father said, this is not anything to do with Germans. We all have this disease. They can do this to any of us. And he said, you kids need to ask yourself, if this ever happened in the United States, would you be the people who hit Anne Frank, or would you be the people who turned her in? And, you know, you guys have all answered that question. You're the ones who would have hidden Anne Frank, and you need to be proud of that. You kept your values, your critical thinking when they were under terrible, ferocious assault. And what I will pledge to you is that I am proud to stand shoulder to shoulder with all of you and with my friend Ron Paul and fight this battle, the Second American Revolution. And I can tell you right now, I do not know whether we're going to win or lose. And I can't tell you, the only thing I can control is a little piece of real estate inside my own shoes. And I can tell you that whatever happens, that I will go down fighting and that I will die with my boots on. Thank you.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man. Finally, whether you are citizens of America or citizens of the world, ask of us here the same high standards of strength and sacrifice which we ask of you. With a good conscience, our only sure reward, with history the final judge of our deeds, let us go forth to lead the land we love, asking his blessing and his help, but knowing that here on earth, God's work must truly be our own.